A lot of you know or suspect that a certain large number of players that were busy in the 30s and 40s were still busy in New York in the end of the 70s and the 80s. The majority of them had been or were veterans of big bands, especially the Basie Band, the Ellington Band, the Cab Calloway Band, the Woody Herman Band. And a lot of those players, when the touring work stopped, he wound up in New York or LA. And in some cases, both, like Jerome Richardson. But of course, I was in New York, and so I ran into, heard, met, and played with a lot of the players from that time. And some of them were still, what you would call famous, like Roy Eldridge, and others were just, the working musicians that we shared gigs and bandstands with, who'd been around in those days and were still around playing, every night. Some of the saxophone players that I recall that I knew around New York then from that time included Eddie Barefield, for example, who had been most famously with Cab Calloway's band during its halcyon years, when Cab was really more akin to a rock star in a way than some of the other band leaders. Not only because he was handsome and charismatic and styled, as well as musically superb, but one thing that may not occur to your listeners, since I'm assuming they probably haven't played the Cab Calloway band book, I have, with his grandson, Chris Calloway Brooks. And when you play the book, it's the original book with the old copying and everything. It's extremely virtuoso, very difficult, because Cab didn't really do the dances. They all played dance music, of course. Lunsford, Duke, Woody Herman, the Dorsey bands, but Cab was more like a rock star. These were shows, and they were showy shows, and so the music's full of fanfares, tempo changes, virtuoso passages, because it was for listening and watching like a show. And I think that's something that people who really understand that era of American entertainment understand, but other people necessarily don't understand that if you're only listening to the records and you're thinking about it from the point of view of just the music. Because Cab's band crossed over. They were the highest paying of the black bands at the time and remained so for quite a while. And while I'm on the subject, I might as well mention that the Widespread Depression band that I had in the 80s played with Cab Calloway himself here in New York more than a couple times. We had to augment the book because his book was a slightly larger horn section than ours. And we played at these giant discos, believe it or not, again, in keeping with the fact that Cab was very showy. Everyone would stop dancing and buy drinks and watch Cab's show. We did 2 20-minute shows. That was it. Because otherwise they wouldn't sell any drinks, because everyone was all loaded on cocaine, pot, LSD, and ecstasy, and they would dance till they dropped. So they wouldn't dance to Cab. They'd go to the bar, have a drink, and watch the show. It was very cost effective for the discos. But Eddie Barefield had been a wrestler, the real deal, like Greek style, and he was in absolutely fantastic physical shape. And his mind was the same. His mind was strong and full of wisdom, and he had a lot to say. He was a wonderful arranger, and he knew the melodies to everything, played beautiful clarinet, and was always sober on the bandstand, both temperamentally and in terms of an intoxication. And I remember one time the two of us wound up at the West End on a gig with Sammy Price, the piano player. No bass, thank God he had the marvelous Jerry Potter on drums. Your listeners might not know Jerry's name, but Jerry Potter, to me, most famously, was the drummer with the great Red Prysock, famous early rock and roll tenor star, brother of Arthur Prysock, whom he music directed for later years. So it was Jerry Potter, Sammy Price, me, and Eddie Barefield. And the whole night, Sammy Price would just not say a word, just start the tunes, And that made me pretty nervous. I was used to having somebody say, we're going to play Just Friends in B flat or something like that. But Eddie Barefield kept me straight, kept me calm, knew all the melodies, all the keys, and that was a real good lesson from Eddie Barefield. And a lot of people, I know Warren Vichet was very close with Eddie Bearfield too, and he would have a lot similar things to say, I think. He was very good to the young musicians. Another night at the West End, I sat with the great Earl Warren, not to be confused with the Supreme Court Justice, the Earl Warren who played lead alto in the original Decca Basie band. And Earl was a real important musician. Just ask Phil Schaap. In a way, I felt that his sound as a lead player tinged the whole Basie band with a beautiful blue miasma. It didn't, in many big bands, tend to get their overall timbre from the lead trumpet. But the Basie band, I don't know. I heard it as Earl Warren's blues-drenched alto. In Duke's band, a lot of listeners heard it as Harry Carney in the baritone section. Kind of set a timbre. I can't describe it in words. Of course, if you could, you wouldn't need music. And Earl Warren sat with me after a set that I played. He was in the audience and proceeded to give me an analysis of my alto style that completely floored me. I dare say, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, but I think a lot of people who are in some kind of so-called creative arts, a lot of us throw in a lot of really tiny personal details that we maybe in the bluff way don't care so much if anybody notices. We say, well, that's for me. Who's going to notice that? But secretly, and I'm admitting a weakness here, secretly, I think a lot of us want or hope someone will notice. And Earl Warren did that for me that night to an extraordinary degree. I had a witness, which was Phil Schaap, who's legendary for having great memory. But Earl Warren sent me out of there walking on a cloud. That didn't always happen. I went to get a saxophone lesson with Nunzio Mondello, who you know is Toots Mondello, the famous lead player from the NBC Orchestra and the Benny Goodman Band. We went for the lesson. He says, play something for me. So I played. The first thing he says to me is, what's wrong with you? Well, I went there for a lesson, not to get petted. So it wasn't always sweetness and light. These guys would talk straight. They cared too much about the music not to. You know, they wouldn't pat you on the back when you were playing a bunch of bull crap. Because again, the music was real to them, of course, as it was to us, and they recognized that in a lot of the younger players who were younger then, of course. There were so many. Percy France, a great tenor player, who my friend Michael Howell, the great guitar player, this anecdote has now entered the discourse. Michael was walking up in Harlem one night, and he looked in a plate glass window at street level, saw a whole crowd of people dancing, but all he could really hear was a saxophone solo. He couldn't really hear the band through the door. So he opened the door and went in. Percy France was playing by himself on stage, playing tenor, and like 80 people were dancing as hard as they could to this guy standing up there blowing by himself. I mean, yeah, that was New York. And I mean, it probably happened other places too. But these guys from that era and women were out there playing, doing their thing, whether it was, still being a superstar like Dorothy Donegan, or if you were just playing gigs. Doc Cheatham spent a lot of time in the 50s and 60s just playing weddings and bar mitzvahs. But by the time I got to New York in the 80s, Doc was a star again, and leading the way for relaxation, good humor, and a kind of jazz that had been in danger of fading away. Something that was just beautiful, swinging, and heartfelt. And that's not in danger of going away now, but it seemed like it might have been at the time. And those kind of musicians guided us and helped vindicate a lot of us, and including, we touched on my friend Scott Robinson. But that was he's a saxophone and clarinet player who also plays trumpet and theremin and pretty much all instruments. But we touched on Scott partly because we were talking about how a lot of the musicians of the generation that I'm talking about, musicians who were born between 1900 and 1920, were really extremely open-minded stylistically and did not really draw stylistic boundaries. We mentioned that Connie Kay of the Modern Jazz Quartet played the Dixieland gig at Eddie Condon's. He played his style. He loved it, and they loved it, and the audience loved it. It was beautiful. And I mentioned that Roy Eldridge told me, and I hope it's in print somewhere, that when Ornette Coleman's famous quartet came to the 5 Spot in New York, he went down there to hear them, and not only heard them, he asked Ornette if he could sit in, and of course he did. And, he drew his own conclusions from that experience. But I found that the musicians of that generation were like that. To them, of course, the music was not historically fixed. Now, with the rise of jazz academia, and I'm participating in it happily here myself, this is not pejorative, but in the rise of academia, it's sometimes too easy to forget that it's really a living, breathing, growing thing that's always changing. And these guys were interested in that because that's what they had done. Who was more avant-garde than Louis Armstrong? He played and sang something that had never been heard on planet Earth. Nothing like it. But they wanted to know what was happening in their art form. Cecil Taylor was a frequent hanger-outer at Condon's and Ryan's and everywhere else. And one famous night, Lester Bowie from the Art Ensemble of Chicago came in his white lab coat and got his ass handed to him, as we say, by Roy Eldridge, who really put the pot on, man. He cooked him right out the door, and Lester Bowie just took his trumpet out of his mouth, threw back his head, and laughed like an animal. I mean, Roy just carved him up, man, and it was beautiful. And even Lester Bowie felt how beautiful it was, because it was really like the old days, man. The crowd loved it. It was just a great moment. And people at Jimmy Ryan's, Haywood Henry, a saxophone player, talk about crossing over musical boundaries. Haywood had played again with Cab Calloway. And another thing that didn't occur to me when I was a kid was I thought the bands were like the Beatles, No, Harry Carney had to take off from Ellington's band. He didn't play every gig. He would take off for months. And Haywood Henry was his sub. So Haywood was a guy who played with all that generation. And then later he became a darling in the studios in New York. And so he would have these great tales about being the tenor sax soloist on Screamin' Jay Hawkins' I Put a Spell on You, and being the bass sax soloist on Lou Reed's Walk on the Wild Side. So not only would you get all these talking and playing from the old school, but these guys were up on the whatever was the cutting edge school of the time too. They were doing everything because they were... Jazz, if you can really play jazz and acquire the skills that it takes to be a working jazz musician, I think you can almost go anywhere in music from there. The demand is so high to be a really true jazz player, however you judge that, and that is subjective. But I think it just prepares you to be ready for any kind of musical situation and meet it with an artistic response. And that's what these musicians were doing. And that's what my friend, we're talking about, Scott Robinson, is still doing, playing theremin in some way out setting, and then playing West End blues with full heart and soul. And that's something that I miss from those times, and I've been trying to avoid in these talks any notion of the good old days, because that's not what this is about. But in that sense, I miss the easy flow that happened a lot then. It's still happening, but less so, I think. Inevitably, of course, given the passage of time.